This meeting is being recorded.
Oh, we have another Lisa.
Or Cameron.
Lisa's so enthusiastic about this presentation. She's got two machines going.
How many are you anticipating?
Well, we have 21 registered, but as I was telling Nyaradzo and Sean earlier, that usually when I've done this in the past, we usually get about 60% of the people who registered. I didn't send out a reminder to folks, which I probably could have, but maybe I'll do that the next time. We have two other webinars planned in this series. Well, three planned and two are set, which I'll mention when we get started here. And Sean, I mentioned to you the last time we talked that I wanted you to be involved with that last one in March, where we're just going to have kind of a preview of the conference and have some of the people with the ICCTE involved with kind of sharing their thoughts about, you know, the value of fellowship and interaction at the conference and so forth.
Sure. When is the second one, Scott? And that's with Richard, I assume?
Second one, Richard actually asked to be postponed until January. So
Okay.
we're going to have a couple of my colleagues from Fox do a presentation on innovation in November, on November the 11th. Nyaradzo, we put you in the category of transformation.
Wow.
No pressure.
Our conference theme is around the kind of the sub themes of foundations, innovation, and transformation. And I figured that what you're going to be speaking about today is talking about not only kind of a transformation of practice, but of the heart as well. So I hope I haven't misread, I won't say your intentions because I don't have your intentions, but that's my suspicion.
We'll force it into that box.
Okay. Well, I told my colleagues on the conference planning committee, it's really important when people start submitting proposals that you don't tell them, sorry, you don't fit in a box, because we want to encourage as many people to come and participate in the conference as we can. So we'll make new boxes if we have to.
All right.
Welcome, folks. We're just doing a little pre-meeting conversation here. And we'll be getting started in just about 2 minutes. And if you just want to quickly introduce yourself and where you're at, that's great. If not, that's fine too.
Well, I'll start. I'm Mary Beth Palama, and I'm at Dordt University.
Hi, Mary Beth. I'm Lisa Duvall Martin, and I'm Redeemer University at Redeemer.
I'm Lisa Olding, and I'm at Trinity Western, and I just dropped my daughter off at school and I'm driving, so I'm leaving my camera off.
Nice.
Morning, my name is Henry Algira and I'm with the King's University in Edmonton, Alberta. And hi, Nyaradzo, it's good to see you.
Hi, Henry. It's good to see you.
It's been a while.
It has.
I'm Paul Schatzberger. I'm at Southern Wesleyan University in South Carolina.
It looks like we have just about as many Canadians here today as we have Americans. That's wonderful.
Dangerous. It's wonderful.
I was going to say good morning, everyone. Angel Krause. I'm at Fresno Pacific University in Fresno, California.
Good morning, I'm Miranda from George Fox.
Well, colleagues, I'm anticipating that a few more people will be logging on, but We are at our start time, and I welcome you. I'm Scott Headley from George Fox University. I'm serving as a co-chair of the ICCTE conference committee that is being hosted by George Fox next spring in May. And in conjunction with our journal, we are hosting a series of webinars this year that will be a lead into the conference. And we're really pleased to bring these to you. And I'm really happy today to have our colleague Nyaradzo Mvududu from Seattle Pacific University, my neighbor to the north, who is going to be our speaker, and Dr. Sean Schatt from Redeemer University in Ancaster, Ontario, will be our moderator and host, and I'm going to turn it over to you two. And I am reminding you all that I am recording this, and we'll make it available to participants and those that weren't able to make it today in the near future.
Thanks, Scott, and good morning, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the ICCTE Journal as well. And I bring greetings from the board also, and we're excited to be working and partnering with the 2022 conference planning team to offer this series of webinars, and really excited that Nyaradzo is positioned to be our first presenter in this series. And Nyaradzo, we certainly welcome you. We're grateful for your time and your preparation as well. And just a little bit of background that Scott and I were talking about planning this, and basically what we chose to do is look back at the journal to see which articles were getting picked up and read a lot, and that kind of guided us to reach out to a couple of authors. So some of the presenters in the series come out of that context. I want to add to just thanks to all of you for being here. We're certainly grateful for your time at a busy time as well. And then just a quick comment about my role as facilitator. Nyaradzo is going to make her presentation kind of without interruption, and then at the end there'll be opportunities for questions, and that's where I'll do my moderator work. I'm going to ask you perhaps to raise your hand in the virtual screen, and then I'll kind of prompt people in sequence at that point to let you know who's the next person to ask the question. So thank you all. Nyaradzo, over to you.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you for having me. When I was asked to do this webinar, I wasn't sure which approach to take, because this is a big topic and can go in many directions. You know, about 10 years ago, when I wrote the article that was published in ICCTE, my focus was on teachers. But of course, this topic touches other areas besides education. So I was once approached by a student, journalist. I don't know if they're called journalists, if they're students, if they have that title yet, but for a college newspaper. And he wanted me to discuss hip hop music. Now, I know nothing about hip hop music, and I shared that with him and directed him to the music department. But he insisted that I was the right person for this interview. And I said, you know, I'll be happy to talk about statistics education. That's kind of my area, but I'm really not a good person to talk to about hip hop music. And he was pretty persistent. We went back and forth, probably about 5 to 6 emails. And finally he said, well, what I really want to talk to you about is to understand, why are Black men angry? And I thought, okay. The snarky part of me wanted to say, because you ask stupid questions like that. But I channeled my mother, who is the more charitable one of my parents. And I just convinced them that, you know what, I think the music department would be better if you want to talk about music. They have more of that background. So I'm going to ask you just to take a minute. Think about a time when you were angry, not just irritated or annoyed, but like Hulk angry. So think about that time. If you got it. Now imagine living in that state all the time. This is what Baldwin says, well, what he said in 1961, to be a Negro in this country is, and to be relatively conscious, is to be in a rage almost all of the time. so that the first problem is how to control that rage so that it won't destroy you. So I've been thinking about this, ever since that student asked me that, because there's certainly times when I feel a rage because of what's going on, but I wanted to think about it more is there like an academic way to think about this? I don't know that I have one, but this webinar is kind of a way to organize my thoughts. So I ask your indulgence as I organize my thoughts. So you're really just watching me think through things. And I hope that the discussion and other discussions on this topic will help those who feel that rage to understand that sometimes that is an appropriate response given the circumstances, and those who maybe don't feel that rage to understand those that do. And hopefully such understanding will lead us to actions that will bring us closer to our founding ideals. So to kind of frame our time together, I thought it might be good to start off with why talk about issues of race. I don't know about you, but it always makes me uncomfortable. I don't like talking about race. I would really much rather talk about some statistical procedure that's way more comfortable for me. So why talk about race? And also kind of getting at, what are we willing to do about it? Now, I can't this is not going to be a comprehensive list of why we should do this, but I'll just highlight some things just to get us, to get us thinking. And I don't have solutions. So if you were expecting that, I apologize. I don't have solutions, but I'd like to be in conversation about steps that we can take to do our part, assuming we're willing to do our part, to encourage you to be more willing to ask yourself, is my discomfort more important than someone else's pain? So for the reasons why we should be talking about this, well, race is a factor in this country. I think we can agree on that. I was listening to NPR as people do to learn things. And they were talking about somebody who was developing an app. And this app was supposed to come on if you're pulled over. I'm not gonna read that first line because if I do that, my phone responds. So I'm not gonna read, but you would say that line and then the recording would start. Now, the fact that there's a perceived need for such an app for me is problematic. Like, the fact that we even need this points to the fact that there's a problem. The target market for this app, they said, was Black people, particularly Black men, for whom being pulled over may not end well. So that's one. And the January 6th insurrection, which many argue was led by white supremacists, people decried that as a loss of democracy. I don't know how it was in your congregations, but in ours, this was a topic for sermons. And one thing that the pastor said kind of had me thinking, because he said that everybody was talking about this loss of democracy, but he was seeing it more as a loss of innocence, that the event brought to light some things that were lurking there, but maybe were hidden. And then, of course, we hear talk of systemic racism. It's a thing. It actually is, it's a real thing. And sometimes I feel like people point to it as a way to absolve themselves of individual responsibility. The point here is not to assign blame, and I'm certainly not seeking to point fingers at anyone. The point is that the system was designed by people. We got here on purpose. So if people designed the system, then people are going to be the ones to dismantle the system. So yes, there's systemic racism, but people are part of that system and they can be part of dismantling it. Another reason to engage in these topics and issues of race is that by failing to do so, we do harm. Now I'm gonna have you think of another time. It might be the same time as the Hulk moment, but think of a time when you were afraid, like really terrified, afraid for your life or that of a loved one. Now imagine living in that state almost all the time. I think there's a reason angels say, fear not. At least that's what we read they say when they, when they introduce themselves. Fear not. I think part of that is that if we are afraid, we may miss something that's important. If fear, if we have fear standing in the way of whatever communication. When you live in fear, you live in a state of hypervigilance all the time. To those that don't live with this fear, this may seem irrational, but this is a real fear and its effects are real. I was at a CCCU, how many C's is that? I never remember how many C's. I was at a seminar and we were doing this activity where we had 3 people to a group and would throw things at each other and catch and, and I have this fear of snakes. I'm terrified of snakes. And people tell me that some snakes are harmless. I don't discriminate. I am terrified of any snake. And one of the objects that was thrown at me was a snake. Now I knew it was a rubber snake. I knew that intellectually, but I couldn't pick it up. I couldn't touch it. And everybody around me was going, it's not gonna hurt you. It's a rubber snake. Like I knew that, but it was still very real to me. So for somebody who doesn't have that fear, it seems irrational, but the fear is real and its effects are real. So what happens when you live in this constant fear or just feel unsafe? What is taken from you when that happens? Racism becomes a public health matter. The cumulative experiences of racial attacks can have a significant impact on your health. There's research to support that. I've just put some references there of research that shows the impact on somebody's health of this repeated trauma. Last year or in the past 2 years with the pandemic, there were many people researching the impact of that on us and on students. And one of the studies looked at what happens to our graduates. And they likened it to the impact of it to a recession. And they found that at the beginning of a career, if somebody begins their career in the teeth of a recession, that they begin like 10 years behind. Their income is depressed for 10 years. And then the impacts get broader and they can expand over decades. So these small things, these traumas can have long-lasting effects. I don't like to talk about torture, but I've read that they tortured people with a drop of water for an extended time, and people were driven insane from just having a drop of water just going on all the time. So you can see that even though the trauma may seem small, if it's persistent over time, it can have long-lasting effects. And I would argue that racism, imposes a trauma on people. And having that for generations, time over time, has a lasting impact on people. So when people say, aren't we past that? Let's move on. They may be missing the impact that trauma has, the long-lasting effects. So it seems that every organization, university, business, government agencies, this broader topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion is front and center in one form or another. I'm sure you've probably been a part of some of those conversations. You're a part of it now, if you haven't before. Because this is not a new topic, there's a danger that people might just go, not again. Why are we still talking about this? Now, I've shared some reasons why we should talk about this, but just so I can stop talking for 2 seconds, I'd love for you to think about why do we need to talk about this uncomfortable topic? And why do we need to talk about white supremacy? So take a few moments to just jot down something in the chat, why you think we should do this. I'm singing the Jeopardy song in my head, then I'll start talking again. As Christians, I think we have a mandate to actually address this issue. We can't just not do it. We can't opt out. Hill says racism is a spiritual problem. So we really need to tap into our Christian roots to address this. What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. That's what Tozer says in his book, The Knowledge of the Holy. So for Christians, there is nothing that shapes our actions and behaviors more than how we see God. Racism is an assault on human dignity. The fact is, we all need to have our humanity restored and recalibrated to what and who God says we are. So think of diversity and all this topic as a means to an end. It's not an end in itself, it's a means to an end, and the end is twofold, so we can see God more fully. And the other part of it is so we can be unified against evil, and in this case, white supremacy. Not whiteness, but white supremacy. I just need to make that clear because sometimes people mix those up. Okay, now let's talk about, we come to the part of what are you willing to do? In her book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, Beverly Tatum likens the system of racism to a moving walkway in airports. Now let's see if this works. Okay. So if you think about the walkway as a system of racism, we can walk along with it and actively participate in it and what it represents. But the thing is, even if we don't walk along with it, even if we just stand there, it moves us along anyway, right, in that direction. For us to actually reverse that direction, we have to walk the other way. Now, I have to tell you, it was really hard to find a video of somebody walking the wrong way on the walkway, but I did find one. But so if you have to actively do something, the opposite. You have to counter that motion to actually go in a different direction. Oops, uh-oh. Let's see. Okay, this might not work. But take my, oh, wait, maybe it will. Okay, never mind. But there is a woman walking the wrong way on the walkway. And it's kind of funny because she stops to adjust her bags and she starts going backwards. And then she has to actively walk the other way. But the point is for us to reverse this movement forward, we have to actively walk the other way. We can't just stand there and say, well, I'm not doing anything, I'm not actively participating, because by doing that, you're actually doing something. Okay. I think I've lost my place here. Okay. So I'm making the case here that we do need to talk about these issues. Like I said, I don't like talking about them. I would much rather talk about statistics. But I'm also the mother of 2 Black men. They'll be so happy I call them men. I usually call them boys. And the grandmother of a Black boy. And I don't get to opt out of engaging in these issues. When there's a shooting in downtown Seattle, I call my boys to go, hey guys, just checking in on you. And they know, and they say, what happened? Did something happen? We're fine. But it could be my kids. So I can't not engage in those conversations, much as I'd rather not. I can't just opt out of it. But we can't just blindly go into these conversations because they're emotional. They bring out that rage that we talked about or that fear. So we have to plan for these conversations. So plan for the worst case scenario. What are you going to do if you start to feel angry or you start to feel guilty or you start to feel afraid or whatever it is? What is it in that conversation that's bringing up that emotion for you? What will the conversation do to relationships? Focus on solutions. What are the rules for having this conversation? What are you going to do if somebody breaks the rules? What are you going to tolerate? What are you not going to tolerate? So we kind of have to think through how this might go and be prepared for it. Because like we said, this is going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be difficult. It's going to bring up all sorts of issues for people. But beyond just having conversations, what are some things that we can do? Every now and again, I come from work and I have a horrible day. And I say to my husband, I've had such a day. I'm going to tell you about my day. I don't want to hear about yours right now. I just need you to listen to my day. So just listen and validate parts that are true withstand somebody else's truth. It's not a competition for you to say, oh, you don't know about my day. You think that was bad? My day was really awful. That's not the point. And that's not to say your day is not important, but that's not what we're talking about right now. Just listen and hear what somebody else is saying. Protect those people that have the most intersectionality. So there's some people who, I'll use myself as an example, female, that might bring some disadvantage, so to speak, Black, immigrant. So that's not typically a winning combination. So, when people have those intersectionalities, we'll be aware of those. Listen, amplify, and act. When my boys used to play soccer, their coach, they had a very quiet coach. And I would walk around, I didn't mean to, but I'll just find myself like right there along the field, walking up and down with the coach. And I'll just repeat what he said, because they could never hear what he was saying. He would say, Brian, cover so-and-so, and they could never hear it. So I would just amplify and say what he was saying so they could hear it. So that's kind of in a similar way. Listen and amplify the message. It may not be your message, your experience, but you've heard it, and you can be an ally and use your platform to amplify so that can be heard. So these are just a couple of the references that I talked about Hill and also Baldwin. And I would love to hear your thoughts and your experiences, because I am not an expert. I'm just somebody who is talking about these things and would like to engage with others so we can work together to get closer to our ideals, to get closer to what God created us to be, in community with one another, and really seeing God in each person. That's helpful for me when, I don't know about you, you may be better people than I am, but I don't always love all my students. But what helps me to be there for them is I say to myself, this one too was made in God's image. Remember that, and I remember that, and that helps me see them differently. So I think just by having these conversations, getting to really care and know each other, we can be in a better place to see God in each person. Thank you for indulging me. I'm gonna stop sharing.
Nyaradzo, thank you so much. Thank you for stepping forward, for sharing your story. There shouldn't be, but there's a lot of courage in what you've done, and you've created a space for dialogue, and that's what you said you wanted to do. And that's, I think it's a blessing to us already, even before the discussions begin. A reminder for those in the group who would like to join the conversation, is just to kind of honor a bit of a sequence. So if you're ready to speak, if you can raise your virtual hand, and then I'll cue you in the sequence of those hands that I see. But not all at once, of course. Scott, that looked like a real hand, but it's the only one moving. Go.
Yes, I couldn't find my virtual hand, but fortunately, even at my advanced age, I can still find my actual hand. So thank you, Nyaradzo. This has really stimulated some thought on my part for leaders, say, for instance, principals, deans, department chairs, and so forth. Because you're serving in a leadership position now in your school at the university, how do you help young faculty members, say white faculty members who may have grown up in a pretty homogenous community, faith community, geographic community, to start to come to grips with the fact that they are preparing young people to go and serve in schools where the faces of the children may be substantially different than the places where they grew up?
Because we are at my university, because we are, even though we're a Christian university, not all students are expected to be Christian. I try to kind of give reasons that are like the reality, right? Give the statistics. This is what the students look like. This is the students in the K-12, this is what they look like. And you have an obligation, a moral obligation to prepare our students to go work in those environments. So are you preparing them well enough? But because we are a Christian university and that's what we believe too, just from that perspective, I also bring that in to say, from this perspective, you also need to see God's children, and you have that mandate. Why should God send his kids to you? Why should he trust us with those kids? So that means you really have to look at those students as, the whole person. And what I know and how I know is not necessarily how everybody else knows. So if you look at what people bring as a strength, then you can use that to hook them to what you want them to learn, rather than looking at, this is what you need to be successful. But I can, when I learned to drive, I had a really hard time with the clutch, because I was learning, stick shift. With the clutch and the accelerator, that you shouldn't have them down at the same time. And I just had a hard time with that. And my instructor, I was learning this in Zimbabwe, and in Zimbabwean culture, a man and his mother-in-law are never in the same space together. Like there's a distance, that's a respect thing. That's just, that's the culture. My instructor said to me, think of the clutch and the accelerator as a man and his mother-in-law. I was like, oh, this can never be at the same, so he was using something that I knew, my culture, to teach me something else. And I try to communicate that to my students, that look at what the students bring and look at it as a strength. How can you use that to teach them what you want them to learn?
Thank you.
But really, I think exposure, being around, because you can read about things, but I think experiences with people that's the best teacher, because not for just expanding your circle. So you have people that look different, that think different. It helps you open your mind, even if you don't agree, but you know what you're not agreeing with. I'd love to hear what other people are doing, what you're doing in your classrooms or in your schools to help people who may not have that experience growing up, to expand their thinking in that way.
Mary Beth, go ahead.
So I am currently teaching on the education department at Dordt University in Sioux Center, Iowa. And that is a concern that a lot of our students raise, especially if they've been brought up in private schools for their K-12 education, and now they want to become teachers, and they're looking at the landscape around them and saying, wow, look how diverse our classrooms are these days. Even in the Midwest, where you might not expect that, but in actuality, regions here in the Midwest are known as the new Latino diaspora. And in our public school district, we have about a third Latino students, and our students are feeling underprepared to work with these students. And so I really appreciate what you said about creating those opportunities for them to interact directly with the students, with the families, that it's more than just hearing information and learning about it from books on how to be culturally responsive. It's actually those interpersonal connections that are going to have the most impact. And so we're trying to do that. We don't find that students are often, readily willing to engage in that way, but we keep, trying to offer those opportunities. And I'd love to know what other people are doing, what kind of opportunities they're providing for just that direct connection to be able to, like you mentioned, Nyaradzo, I love that that acronym LOVE, listen, understand, validate. And that's something I'll bring to my courses too, because, you know, being able to hear the experiences, the perceptions, the perspectives, you know, and having that firsthand interaction, I think is just so important. So
we're also pretty intentional about where we place our students for internship, just to, you know, to help them gain that experience and see what it's actually like. You know, so that's as much as we can, we try to place our students in very diverse settings so they can experience that.
Sure.
I had a very fascinating experience, Nyaradzo, when I taught a multicultural education course 2 years ago and 3 years ago. I haven't taught it for a couple of years, but both years that I taught it to our first year education candidates here and just outside of Hamilton, Ontario. Our location's pretty unique that there are a lot of rural communities nearby. And then there are a lot of fairly large urban communities nearby. And it took me a while to recognize a pattern that needed to be named. And that is people who've been raised in rural communities that are fairly monocultural, even really good Christian people, have no clue what they've picked up and what they're spreading out. On the flip side, this is why it needs to be named. We had a lot of students who had grown up in very urban communities where multiculturalism was reality, and they were looking around like, why is this even a problem? It just is what it is. And the disparity between those two groups and getting them to talk on the same page in the same world was really, really hard to do. And I didn't expect that. So I had to get better at it. And we started just by naming things, right? And let's talk about this. And again, we have really good people, but there are still some pretty good people who are racist, and we need to name it and deal with it and amplify it. Lisa, and then Kathy. You're muted, I think.
Sorry. Thanks, Sean. I've inherited the course that Sean is talking about. So I'm sitting here thinking, wow, would you be open to being a guest speaker in the class? I think the truth of bringing other faces, voices into the classroom is really rich experience and necessary. And the other piece that strikes me is fostering a global perspective in our teacher candidates by whatever the course design is, but really getting them to think beyond their present context, particularly around education reform and inequity in education globally. I think those are it's really important to give them a bird's eye view so that when they're in their context, it has context. Particularly in Ontario, where our public system teachers are paid very well, have wonderful benefits and holidays, etc. And that I call it golden tether in my writing, but that can be a golden tether. And if you don't have that global perspective, you don't have a context in which you are actually teaching. You are in a bubble. So breaking that bubble and I think from a Christian heart, that creates empathy and compassion. And I'm new to the Christian research world in the last year. And I love the fact that the truth of Imago Dei and what that means in teaching in that context, like especially a multicultural education course, or bringing that piece in is such a beautiful weaving of truth, and truth sets us free. So I really appreciate, and I will probably email you. Thank you,
I'll look forward to it.
Okay. Kathy.
Oh, thank you so much for all you've shared this morning. I particularly appreciated your analogy about the clutch and the accelerator, and how your instructor linked that to your own cultural experience, you know, found a story that you could identify with. I mean, I even think back to reading I did, you know, back in the 80s, you know, around missions and, you know, identifying, you know, the cultural connection point, you know, in a missions context. I was recently reading an article where Jamar Tisby was being interviewed, and he used the analogy of, okay, well, you know, with regard to racism, you know, as a blind spot. If you're driving your car and you change lanes and you don't see the other car, you're still going to be in a dangerous situation. And it's like, you can't just, you know, ignore or excuse or dismiss the fact that you've got a blind spot. And so how do we help our colleagues to identify and recognize those blind spots, and maybe with the nice little gentle ding, ding, ding in the little side view mirror, and not smash, you're about to, like, you know, have a huge wreck here. So how can we lovingly help to guide and direct our colleagues to recognizing and acknowledge and work through their blind spots?
Yeah, I think we all have blind spots, and because they are blind spots, we don't know that we have them necessarily. But I think having people around you that care for you, that you trust, that can say, yeah, you're not seeing this thing in a way. And I think it comes from having relationships with people, right? If people you care about, people that you know care about you, say something, you hear it differently than if it's some stranger who points out your blind spot, right? You gotta be defensive if it's somebody else, but if it's somebody that you know they're helping you and you take it that way, then it doesn't feel good, but but you will hear it differently, and hopefully you will take steps to act. Because I don't think anybody ever arrives, and kind of has it figured out. One of my friends whose job is to do exactly that, help people. She was telling me a story of when she was a guest speaker in a classroom, and there was somebody who had a wheelchair in the classroom. So she decided that she would set up the classroom before the student came in, and removed chairs from each table so that the student in the wheelchair would be able to to find a spot. And she was so proud of herself. She had done this thoughtful thing, and she said, "Hey, I made some space, so for your wheelchair." And the student said, "You mean for me? It's not about the wheelchair, it's about the," and she said, she was just like, this is what I do. I'm sorry. And I missed it. I missed that. So I think we all have those, we're all constantly growing if we have that attitude that we can learn from everybody, then we might actually learn something. I find that when I go into a situation and I say, I'm going to learn at least one thing, that I learned something. I even learned something from 50 Cent. He was being interviewed by Oprah back when Oprah had a show, and it was kind of like in the background, because I thought, it's not really, as you know now, hip hop is not really my thing, so I wasn't really paying attention. But then he was asked a question about because I guess he's been shot at several times, but he still lives in the same neighborhood, or his grandmother does. And Oprah said to him, "How do you, aren't you worried? Aren't you concerned? You live in the same neighborhood, they never caught the person." And he said, "You either worry or you pray. You can't do both." And I was like, wait, rewind, what did 50 Cent just say? So I think you can learn something from anybody, because I think somebody knows something that you don't know, and if you go in with that attitude, and if you go in with that with your friends, they will be able to point out those blind spots because there's something that you miss that somebody else can see.
Thank you.
Or Angel or Cynthia or Paul or the other Lisa, you want in on this at all?
I can say just thank you for helping us process. I'm processing. I feel like I'm, multiple layers in where my mind has already taken me. So I thank you for, I love all the analogies. I love that you started with putting us in a place of both anger and fear to connect with others. I think that's so important in understanding, others. So I appreciate that. I think where my mind is just taking me is how do we approach this topic differently as Christian educators? So what do we do that's unique versus what, the public institutions across the city are doing? And how does that direct people towards Christ? And of course, that's within the framework of the larger church that's having lots of different challenges all over the place. And so I think that's where I keep on going back to is how do I use my conversations to point both our Christian and non-Christian, non-believing students back to Christ within this conversation.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm more silent than not, but any thoughts as far as how that interplays, because I think the importance of it is in our program, is integrated in the text we read and the articles we read and the conversations we have. But I think I'm just constantly thinking, well, how are we doing this differently than the state university? How are we pointing towards Christ in that?
Yeah, I think one advantage, I guess, that we have as Christian educators is that we can explicitly talk about our Christian faith, where in a public space that may not be as welcome. When I was at the University of Washington, I had one professor who, there was something different about him. I didn't really know what was different about him, but I overheard some students talk about him and they said, he's a Christian. And I thought, oh, maybe that's what there was just a way he carried himself, a way he interacted with students that was different. So I think sometimes who we are and how we are with people says a lot more than what we might say. It makes people kind of go, what's going on with that person? Now, I'm curious about that person. And that may be the opening to talk about, well, for me, this is what makes me this way, my faith. And you can talk about it in a way that doesn't feel like, people say, don't beat me on the head with it. That can be a way that doesn't beat somebody on the head with it, but it's just, this is your identity. This is who you are. This is how you act if you're a Christian. I don't really have I don't have an answer, but that's just something that I think as somebody who teaches stats, and for a long time, I would have, one of the questions on the student evaluations is how we integrate our faith in our teaching. And students would say, well, I don't know how you would really do that in stats, but she obviously is a Christian because of, the way she did this. And I always appreciated that, because I would struggle with, how do I integrate it in a way that is authentic, not just like a check the box, or I should say something so the students can say it. So I always appreciated when students said that.
So I appreciated the insight that racism has traumatic effects, intergenerational effects. That's an aspect I had not thought about before. Here in Canada, we commemorated the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation just last week, Thursday, where the intergenerational traumatic effects of residential schooling, that is so evident And I'm pleased to see that in a weird, in an odd way, I'm pleased to see that that's gaining traction in America too. That awareness is being raised in America with the Indian boarding schools. But what really helped us in our program is that we brought in some Indigenous elders who are Christian, I mean, to provide, well, what does that mean? How have they lived this?
Yeah.
What has life been like for them? But then they shared their culture. So it's raising, for us, it was helpful that they raised awareness, but then shared their culture just to help us understand better an Indigenous way of life, an Indigenous thinking. That was very useful. So I thank you that you mentioned that, racism poses as trauma for generations.
That's interesting that you talk, you talk about the culture that the Indigenous people kind of bring to their Christianity. I think sometimes I always imagine God sitting there and shaking his head and going, I never said that. Where were you getting that? Because I think sometimes people with very good intentions will go into a culture and want to make it like their culture. But when those aspects are not really the Christian part. I know in Ghana, there were missionaries that went there, and in Ghanaian culture, when you're celebrating and happy, there's a lot of drumming. In other African cultures as well. And the missionaries felt like drumming that way was inappropriate, that maybe an organ was more appropriate than, and this was just very foreign to the Ghanaians, and they didn't understand how this God they were supposed to be celebrating and loving and, was just so different from who they were. So they really couldn't connect with Christianity because somebody overlaid their culture to what Christianity actually was. So, when you mentioned that the Indigenous people were sharing their culture as well as, like, the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. We all bring our cultural overlay to, if you go to Catholics here are very different from Catholics in Mexico, because the cultural overlay is part of that. I think if we recognize that we are different and yet the same, what's the core, what makes us Christian, that's going to be the same, but maybe how we express that may look a little bit different in each culture.
Say, friends, a quick reminder, we are hosting May 24 to 26, the ICCTE conference at George Fox in Oregon with a virtual component as well. So for those that are too far to travel or who have concerns about the pandemic and so forth, we are planning on a virtual option. And I just wanted to thank Sean for hosting and Nyaradzo for speaking today, and for all of you for being here. Wow, I've got a lot to process now, and I've got other work to do today, as I'm sure you all do. So thank you for taking the time to be with us this morning. Let's show our appreciation for our speaker, and maybe a virtual hand, or yes, thank you. And our next webinar is scheduled for November the 11th, which is a Thursday at 0900 Pacific. There will be more information coming out soon about that. And as I said at the beginning, we'll make this recording available soon. So keep an eye out for an email coming either from me or from ICCTE about how you can obtain that. Thank you all. Blessings to you. And remember, we are all made in the image of God. I think that was my big takeaway today. And even though I may not fully understand the diversity of God's kingdom and the diversity of humanity, I can celebrate the fact that it is representative of something about God that I'm still learning more and more each day, and that makes me happy. So good day to all.
Thank you, everyone. I put my email in the chat.
Thank you.